Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining. We'll go ahead and get started and people can join as they are able. Thanks so much for joining this session focused on learning and opportunities for practical peace building and engagement in restrictive or closed societies. So my name is Kelsey Hampton. I'm Senior Officer for Global Policy and Outreach at Search for Common Ground. I work with Search's country teams in the Middle East and Asia to advance our peace building advocacy priorities, particularly with the US government. So for those who don't know, Search for Common Ground is the world's largest dedicated peace building organization, working to transform violent conflict and build safe, healthy, and just societies. We work in over 35 countries across Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. And a great deal of our peace building work is done in partnership with local civil society. So in 2023 alone, we partnered with over 670 local organizations around the world. In many of the places that we work, and as for a lot of you, I'm sure, the authorities are making it extremely difficult to implement peace building programs. Concerns about outside influence, fear of democratic or resistance movements, or perhaps a desire to maintain control over the population. So in places like Central Asia and Latin America, national governments are increasingly restricting civil society space, whether through more formal measures like NGO or foreign agent laws, or by creating more and more bureaucratic obstacles to registration and implementation of activities. So often these measures impact not just direct peace building activities, but also human rights, civil society strengthening, justice programs, etc. And where authorities are imposing these harsh restrictions or even interfering in programs, we want to think about how all of us in the peace building field, donors and implementers alike, can think creatively about how to achieve peace building goals and foster safer and healthier societies. So I'm very excited today that we'll hear from 3 peacebuilding leaders who are working in different environments where civil society is often under direct threat. And we get to learn from their experiences implementing peacebuilding programs and engaging with authorities who can be hostile at times. So I'll do quick introductions and then we'll jump into some discussion. So first we'll have Zora Bahman, who's Search's country director in Afghanistan, based in Kabul, where she leads a team of 50 staff and 22 implementing partners working across the country. Zora has 20 years of work experience in the fields of peace building, human rights, gender, and the development of civil society in Afghanistan and abroad. Kanesh Nazarov is Search's country director in Uzbekistan, based in Tashkent, as well as our Asia Regional Conflict Advisor. He previously worked as Search's country director for Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia Programs Director, and through all these roles has expanded Search's programming around conflict-sensitive journalism, promoting freedom of religion, providing alternative narratives to recruitment, empowering youth and women, preventing radicalization, and building Track 1.5 and Track 2 diplomatic cooperation. And then Rebecca Besant is Search's Latin America Regional Director, overseeing our relief and peacebuilding programming in Mexico, Venezuela, and Guatemala. Rebecca is also Search's Senior Director for Program Effectiveness, where she leads Search teams in ensuring high-quality peacebuilding programming around the world. Working in Africa for the past 20 years, Rebecca has acquired expertise in a range of different areas of programming, including strategic visioning, project design, and fundraising. So we want to start with some scene setting for this conversation about, what we're actually talking about when we talk about civil society being under threat. So let's talk about what those problems are. So Zora, Kanesh, and Rebecca, let's outline some of the restrictions that each of your regions or the country contexts face. So what kinds of bureaucratic obstacles, government interference, security restrictions, etc., do you face in your work with civil society? And let's maybe start with Zora.
Thank you, Kelsey. And it's good to be here and good to be amongst peace builders. I see some familiar names, and some new names. I don't want to give a history lesson here, but it's really important to to contextualize the restrictions that we're facing in Afghanistan with a little bit of recent history. So in Afghanistan, there's been, in the 20 years of international occupation in Afghanistan, there were two distinct camps. It was the human rights, civil society, democracy camp, which was urban, and then the opposition, the Taliban, the rural, and so on. And within these camps, a lot of course, there was a lot of segregation, and a lot of war. A lot of the war that was fought was between these two camps. Of course, on the side of the civil society was also the military, international and national. And within this context, some peacebuilding programming did take place, but these peacebuilding programming actually did not move across these dividing lines. They didn't attempt to create anything that we could really truly class as peacebuilding. And when the Republic fell and the Taliban took over and the Republic disintegrated, for the Taliban, the immediate enemy and the other, as it was created and strengthened, was the civil society. So it was the women's rights activists, it was the local NGOs and so on, and the civil society that came with arts and cultures and so on. Of course, there was an ideological difference as well. There was freedoms, there was music, there was things that the Taliban were always made to believe was from outside. And then there was also a clear link between the civil society, which in Afghanistan was traditionally local NGOs rather than social movements and political movements that sort of dealt with more human rights stuff. So immediately, this civil society was seen as something outsiders had an influence through. So the restrictions we have right now is in light of this historical relationship between the Taliban, who are now the authorities, and the civil society. And then what you hear in the news around strict implementation of regulations, a lot of it actually dates back from the Republic time, but they were not implemented as harshly. And also some other restrictions on women, for example, women's work and so on, that don't necessarily address the civil society, but then it has disproportionate impact on how effective the civil society can be. But within this, there's another conflict between the Taliban and the international community. And within that, civil society is also harmed. So we're not only suffering from the restrictions and the extra scrutiny in Afghanistan, but we're also facing a radical reduction in the international technical and financial aid in the country. Those of us that are working the hardest inside the country, trying to keep the space open, is also losing trust from our longtime supporters. We're seen as functioning in a space that's shrinking. And any success that we have, any doors that we open is seen with suspicion, and that also dates back to the way the international community in the 20 years of democracy dealt with the civil society. It was always a donor and a recipient relationship rather than a true partnership. So now that the space is relatively changed and Afghans are in a position where they don't have a lot of links with the international community, the programming is now the most successful and effective programming in civil society are now Afghan-led, then that trust doesn't exist. It's as if Afghans have been left to do things on their own, and that is something new. So there's a lot of restrictions and issues from all over our operational environment. I think I've spoken a lot. Maybe we can touch some of these issues in a minute. So back to you, Kelsey.
Great, thanks, Zora. Kanesh, let's go to you to outline some of the restrictions and obstacles in Uzbekistan and maybe more broadly in Central Asia.
Thank you, Kelsey, for the question. Hello, everyone, and I'm glad to be joining you from Central Asia in today's discussion. And for those of you who are not familiar with, mainly I will talk about the civil society landscape in Central Asia, and particularly in Uzbekistan, and where I'm based. And the civil society in the previous regime prior to 2017, the civil society was completely shut down, and there were only a handful of civil society organizations who were functioning during the previous regime. And since 2017, I think with the new agenda and new leadership in Uzbekistan, there is a lot going on. The reform processes are going on, but nevertheless, there are, still, I would say, the remnants of the old system still exist. And one of them is, mostly I would say, these are the bureaucratic restrictions where, the registration of the office, if you decide to open an office, is one challenge. And once, even if you go through that challenge, then every time when you have a new program or the project, you will still have to go and get an approval from, for example, all of the civil society organizations are, reporting to, or the, functioning under the Minister of Justice, where imagine that more than now 15,000 different civil society organizations in the country will have to appeal to the MOJ centrally and to get the approvals for the project even before you start the process. And at the same time, once, even if you get the approval, then you will have to appeal every time when you hold any particular, especially the public events and activities. So these are, I would say, mostly related to the bureaucratic restrictions where you will have to appeal, and which will impact in the tempo and the overall the project cycles, and it will create a considerable delay in program delivery. So that is kind of at the national level, but then at the grassroots level, because of there is still some kind of I would say, the fear from the previous regime, and at the grassroots level, it's still is a bit of a limbo, where they will have to wait for even an informal approval of any activities on the ground. So overall, that's, I would say, the bureaucratic restrictions in hand, even though a lot of the reform processes are underway under the new regime. Maybe I will stop now, and then so that we can discuss more the details. Yeah? Thank you, Kelsey.
Great, thank you, Kanesh. Rebecca, how about what you are seeing in Latin America? I know that's a broad region, but maybe give us a sense of some of these civil society space restrictions that you're seeing there.
Sure, and I think I'll talk about Venezuela specifically in this in this case. And, echoing my colleagues, thank you everyone for coming this afternoon, especially, another panel and a list of them. So thank you for joining us. I mean, I think it's similar to what Kanesh was saying around kind of the degrees of bureaucratic restrictions, and then how those bureaucratic restrictions can be used at different times depending on what the context is. So, Venezuela is unfortunately in the news right now because of the elections situation and what recently happened, but the restrictions have been in place and kind of moving in and out depending on what was going in country, but what was also happening kind of in the international sphere related to Venezuela. And so I think the three that I would particularly point to, one is just the registration process for international organizations. It's been a little while now that technically and legally international organizations could actually register, but according to the INGO Forum, like up till now, none has actually succeeded in getting the registration. So most people file, but then whether or not the approvals actually come through and what that means. The second is the NGO law that has just recently been passed in the lead up to the elections, and it remains to be seen, especially given the current context, how strictly will be enforced, to what degree it will be weaponized against civil society, and how different authorities at different levels could use different elements in it. And so there's just a lot of watching and waiting, but concern about how the NGO law will affect kind of the bureaucratic space and the operational space. I think the third is, just the classification on activities as potentially political, and activities that are considered political are not allowed to be implemented by NGOs, but who defines what that is? And again, depending on the context at the time. And then sanctions and the impact of sanctions on the operational space, both in the big picture, but then also in the practicalities of, money getting in, being able to implement, being able to pay staff, those kinds of questions. So those are some of the challenges, not unique to Venezuela, but definitely complicating the engagement there.
Great, thank you for that. You've all touched a little bit on how the international community, international dynamics impact this space as well. So the sanctions in Venezuela, we know in Afghanistan, the kind of mass exodus of international financial contributions have made a big difference. But maybe I can ask each of you to talk a little bit more about how international interventions make it maybe more difficult for local civil society to achieve their goals, or if there are other more positive examples of how international actors, whether donors, aid agencies, or diplomatic officials, how they're more positively impacting the civil society space. So kind of those international dynamics, how does that make a difference in the context in which you're working? Maybe Zura, we can go back to you to start.
Okay, it's really interesting on how things work and on a day-to-day basis working with civil society in Afghanistan. Search runs one of the biggest active civil society networks in the country. We have over 170 organizations that are based in Afghanistan, working in Afghanistan together in our network. It's called the Nexus Group, and it's really fascinating how these organizations navigate. And as we meet every month, until a couple of years ago, we were meeting all in a big tent in our office, but now we meet separately, men and women, in smaller groups. And none of our meetings are actually, secret or anything. It's part of our civil society registered programming, small grants that we give to around 70 organizations, and building the capacity to lead and to manage these grants. When we talk to these organizations, they usually, the first thing they talk about is funding. Now, as a civil society activist, for myself, it's sad that we are still aid dependent, but that's the reality on the ground. Afghanistan has very fragile economy, and its civil society are intrinsically linked with development, humanitarian aid industry. And this is, initially I thought this was a problem, but then later on I feel that this is a modality that could be strengthened in restrictive environments. To have the modality where you have a distinct social movements, that is ideal, but in Afghanistan we haven't had that for a long time. What we had was either civil society that was linked with aid delivery or development programming, or we had a distinct advocacy and human rights organizations. Now, what that human rights and advocacy organizations did was to create a separate field of advocacy. That, I think, was counterproductive for creation of a social movement, because social movements have to travel along sort of, they have to run their course, they have to find themselves, they have to find people who are passionate, and they need to have people that are committed. But when you move advocacy, when you move social change into programming and short-term programming, then what you do is you allow donors and you allow external factors to determine agendas. So what we had was, women's organizations that did 6 months of advocacy programming, 2 years of advocacy programming on elections and women's participation. And then the next thing they did was around, let's say, access to health and so on. So this was just, it professionalized advocacy and social change. Now, I can see a continued effort to do that. And that is not productive for Afghan women. What the international community is doing is giving $5,000, $10,000 to Afghan women's organizations and placing them in a confrontational space with the emirate, with the Taliban. It endangers them socially, and it endangers them in their livelihoods as well. And then these programs don't allow their organizations to survive. What I think we should do is to move towards more nexus programming, where women would truly feel empowered, where their job is not to change, to focus on social change only, but their job is to provide a service by women for women. And once in the context of Afghanistan, which is, by the way, inherently patriarchal, it's not just the people versus the Taliban. There's a lot of complexities around there. So if the international community wants to support the Afghan civil society, what they need to do is to make sure that that advocacy, human rights, and social issues are not separated from delivery of services. But women and vulnerable groups, youth, ethnic and religious minorities should be empowered within the framework of delivery of humanitarian aid, within the framework of development, so that they can still gather, so that they can still have the relevant skills, so that they can naturally move towards a thematic advocacy that they feel passionate about. And I think the women with the strongest social capital and the ability to change in Afghanistan from the civil society are women who work in health, are women who work in primary education, are women who work in media. And the more we strengthen those, the better the outcomes are going to be, and the more sustainable the outcomes are going to be. The more we move women from the service delivery into the advocacy, human rights field with shorter term funding, or funding that only informs the outside the advocacy, the international advocacy, we are endangering them. And we are putting, we're basically creating more complexities with the mistrust that's between the Taliban and the civil society. Of course, we can explore each of these issues more, but back to you, Kelsey.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Rebecca, maybe to go to you next, you mentioned the sanctions, international sanctions on Venezuela making a difference for civil society. Can you give us more of a sense of how that's impacting civil society actors themselves, the space in general, all of that?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, the international community has limited tools that it can use. And on one hand, it's, you know, easy to criticize of what's being done. On the other hand, we haven't seen other tools come in that are effective. And sanctions are one of the few tools that the international community, and particularly the US, has to act. I think that, you know, it happens kind of in two ways, both in terms of power dynamics. You know, the US will take an action, and because Venezuela has limited action that it could take back, it then plays out the repercussions on civil society. And so the punishment sort of trickles down, or the reaction trickles down, rather than kind of going where the challenge was coming from. I think also, I mean, echoing what Zura said about, you know, it's disappointing that people are dependent on international aid, and it's a reality. And it's a reality where 7 million people have migrated out of Venezuela because of the economic crisis and those kinds of challenges. And so the fact that there's very limited funding for civil society engagement, where there is funding, it can also sometimes put civil society activists at risk. It can also affect their credibility, because now they're propped up as, you know, foreign supported activists rather than you know, locally driven, locally credible. And kind of you end up in that caught between the tensions of, you have international support, which you need, and which, you know, offers economic opportunities that perhaps doesn't exist, but it does affect how you're perceived by the government, how you're portrayed, and those kinds of questions. So yeah, and just, I mean, the impact on the economy, the sanctions haven't succeeded in any way of affecting the ruling party. And we've seen numerous times, like, sanctions affecting actually ordinary citizens, ordinary individuals, the businesses and livelihoods that people need. And instead, you know, the repercussions or the consequences of the action don't fit the intention.
Yeah, thank you for that. Kinesh, how about in Uzbekistan, how are you seeing the role of international actors impacting positively or negatively the civil society space, and how local civil society especially are able to achieve their goals in that region?
Thank you for the question, and I think I will take here. I will approach this question from the perspective of international aid, I would say. As I said, the civil society is relatively new or rebuilding itself in Uzbekistan under the new leadership. So I would say that, you know, the international aid or the international programs, you know, often forget about the fact, that the context, that the overall capacity of the civil society, where we are starting from. Because where, you know, during the previous regime, where the civil society was almost completely abolished, and now we have new programs coming from the international organizations, and, you know, the thresholds are a lot, you know, I would say higher, and, you know, the requirements are a bit harsh, but this international aid is oftentimes forgetting about the overall capacity of the civil society on the ground in the country, and I think the international community ought to think about, you know, even though the programming could be facilitating or the you know, strengthening the civil society's role, but at the same time strengthening the capacity, some component could be devoted to strengthening the capacity of the civil society itself vertically, meaning that, you know, the how civil society can be a constructive voice, transmitting the grievances and the voices and the problems on the ground to the national level institutions and including some of the advocacy areas, but at the same time, the horizontally, so that even the civil society organizations we have today in the country could build a better cohesive relationship amongst themselves, and then also with the relevant state and non-state institutions on the ground. And that is very, very important, I think, from the context of the country where civil society is trying to rebuild itself. And, how we can capacitate or, facilitate the civil society so that they can stay relevant to their own mission, which is like, strengthening the civic participation and civic activism, but at the same time being, an ally or the partner to the international community. And I think particularly like, in the geography of former Soviet Union countries, and recently in the last few years, the foreign agent law, which has been initiated in Russia a few years ago, it's just trickling down into a number of different neighboring countries, and that is going to hurt one way or the other the civic activism, civic participation, as well as it's going to impact how the government will approach overall its relationship with the civil society. And I think the international community should also focus around that and being the ally or the partner to the civil society and bringing up the voices to the relevant decision makers, whether it in national level or the provincial levels. And so I would like to particularly make that those points. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And I think that's something that we see so much in our work at Search for Common Ground, and I'm sure others as well, that accountability piece and supporting local civil society to hold the authorities accountable and to, challenge unjust systems within their country. That is one of the things that we see as an important role for these groups to play. We see that civil society are often the agents of change, and they can, if they're resilient and strong enough, they can withstand shocks of crisis moments and then help to rebuild institutions. But if they are also undermined and caused to close or their space restricted, then those institutions can take much longer to rebuild after a community or a country has moved on from an acute crisis. So I think that's something that we hear a lot across all of our country programs as a really key part of why we need to support local civil society. And maybe to pull on this a little bit, we're talking about, in a lot of these contexts, we're talking about restrictive authorities that might try to interfere with our own programming or with others' programming. So how can we, maybe based on your own experience in these countries, how do we and others maintain our principles and values and independence in these contexts? Maybe Kinesh, we can start with you. How do we maintain the operational space, but also sticking to our principles and values?
I think maybe from the perspective of a peacebuilding organizations, and maybe definitely it will be different from the if you pose this question for the human rights defender organizations. But in our situation, I think as a peacebuilding organization, three things are very important. One is how we ourselves stay relevant and honest to our own mission, which is the peace building, right? And being an catalyzer for a constructive voice or the constructive approaches in the country, and both identifying the civil society organizations who are really would like to contribute meaningfully to the overall country's development or the human rights angle or anything you particularly pick an issue. But at the same time, I think, being, effective in that restrictive environment without really creating an safety and security issues for the organization's reputation and risks, and as well as the people who are standing behind this kind of mission. And I think this is very, very important area. And, identifying how we can carve ourselves and more kind of a convenient, I would say, the space, in one hand being effective in advocating, on the other hand being also relevant to our own mission as well. And after all, for us, we look into a very long-term kind of change, where we would like to see all societies, not only the particular countries. Today we are talking like from 3 different geographic angles, but around the globe, how we can build a better, healthier, safer, and a just societies, so that people could freely exercise their own rights, but at the same time being accountable for their own responsibilities. So I would say that, highlight that, and I'm sure that my colleagues will contribute more in that. Thank you.
Yeah, Rebecca, what would you like to add to this question about how we balance our operational access with our values?
Absolutely. I think 3 things I would sort of say. The first is remembering that often civil society sort of becomes classified as a certain kind of people or a certain kind of persona. And I think that feeds into setting civil society up as often being the opposition or that kind of thing. And so I think one thing is, how do we demonstrate our peace building values? By making sure that we're bringing people into a definition of civil society that's broader and more representative of different perspectives. And that, whether that's geographic diversity, ethnic diversity, political diversity, but having that representation and making sure that our strategies and our approaches are drawing on that diversity is really important. Because not often, but sometimes what is happening needs a different lens and needs a different analysis to also help you understand how to navigate the situation you're in. I think the second thing is that civil society engagement is often framed as adversarial, and it's perceived that that's the only way. And that there are opportunities where, peace builders and civil society can be allies of government, and we have shared interests and we have shared considerations. And how can we do it in a holistic way that both makes a government or a set of government authorities succeed, and civil society and the population gain and improve as well? And how do we try to reframe the relationship to look for those opportunities for collaboration? And then I think the third one is, so often we kind of turn entities into kind of a non-being. So government authority or the opposition or the ruling party or whatever it is, but remembering that all of those bodies are made up of people. And how do you humanize the individuals within it? You look for champions, and you look for who are the people that are trying to share, support their community, serve their community in different ways. And maybe they have different perspectives on it, or they come at it from a different way, but there are those entry points where you can build trust and you can make progress. And then with that, maybe you're not tackling the big problem, but you are tackling an important problem, and it lays the foundation for continued engagement towards that longer vision that Kanesh mentioned.
Zora, do you have anything to add from your particular experience in Afghanistan?
Yes, I have a lot to add. I've had to hold my breath so many times in the last 3 years as I waited to hear how people were going to talk about values and how it is going to impact my livelihood and my ability to be there as an active civil society member. And this was throughout the civil society. So every time the Taliban announced, it's a pattern that repeated itself many times. So many times the Taliban would announce something like they recently did. They announced a new law restricting a lot of freedoms for very many people, including very strictly on women. And as they announced, then we then wait and watch how the international community is going to talk about values and how this debate around values is going to be used to further take away and disempower the civil society in Afghanistan, how funds are going to be reduced, how technical support is going to be reduced, how people who are still managing to function are going to be vilified, how people are going to be given this sense of disempowerment and taken out of our context, whereas remaining in that context, they could make a lot of changes. So number one thing that we should do is to question whose values are we talking about and who is it that is defining these values. Sometimes I see there's a confusion between humanitarian values and the values we need to have in the peace building field. And to follow what Rebecca was saying, I completely agree with Rebecca. And if we need to have more nuanced view of the ground, and we need to put local leaders in a position to define what these values should look like in the country. Because otherwise what we're doing is we are hoping that the government and restrictive governments should start complying with our values so that then the civil society could function. But it's not, that shouldn't be the case. The reality is that we need to empower civil society to hold those values, but then to function in a way that is going to create sustainable change, that is going to steer this non-cooperative government and other non-cooperative entities towards a space where these values become shared values. And that is at the heart of what peace building should look like. But on the ground in Afghanistan, this is not how peace building looks like, especially when it comes to funding. It looks like something that's conflated with with humanitarian values, which I deeply respect, but that's another conversation on how that needs to be operationalized as well. And also sometimes we see that when we talk about values, we talk about values in relation to distribution of resources, and also this applies very differently to local actors compared to international actors. When we look at the values that we need to hold very dear to ourselves in peace building, and we see bigger, larger organizations, the UN system, and so on, I don't see that those values are being operationalized in their day-to-day work in my country. A radical move from localization into more internationalization. Is that our values, for instance? Holding the Taliban accountable, investing a lot in international advocacy about the Taliban actions, whereas refusing to have a quota for aid that should be distributed by women for women in Afghanistan. Is that Is that holding our values? So we need to see how we hold the values, not only when it comes to selecting a partner or when we're dealing with the local civil society, but also how we enact it ourselves and within our own industry. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. All excellent points and things for us to think about. So I want to ask one more question to kind of conclude this portion, and then we'll open it up for audience questions and comments. So be thinking about your interventions that you'd like to make. But to my colleagues, let's conclude by thinking through, what have we learned from these contexts about how the peacebuilding field can better support civil society? What changes are needed, whether in our own approaches as implementers or perhaps from donors or policymakers? What changes might be needed to ensure that we can better empower and support civil society for healthier, safer, and more just societies? So if you have specific examples from each of these contexts to share, that would be great. But broadly, what have we learned and what can we do better? Maybe I will go to Rebecca first, if that's okay, and then Kinesh and Zura.
Sure. I think there's lots of lessons learned and there's lots of repeating the same mistakes. But I think one of the lessons learned that I would share is just it's hard to be in the context. It's hard when you're kind of on the roller coaster of things are getting better. Oh no, it's getting more restrictive. And looking at Venezuela right now with the current context, just how disappointed and sort of disillusioned a lot of people are. And I think one of the lessons learned is the importance of connecting peace builders with an external community of people struggling with similar challenges, both for new ideas, but also just the hope that it offers that an opening may come. And I just remember when one of my Venezuelan colleagues had the chance to join a brown bag on Afghanistan with Zura, and just she got off, she was like, okay, if they can work like that in Afghanistan, like I've got some thoughts of what we could possibly do. And it just helps to, again, have that perspective and to help keep that long-term picture that maybe we're not there now, maybe the possibilities aren't there now, but how do I remember that openings can come? And how do we build the foundation so that when an opening comes, we can leverage it and use it to the fullest potential. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Kinesh, over to you.
I'll make three very short points around the lessons learned, or as Rebecca said, what we repeat our mistakes all the time. And I think one of the first point is around whether we can find champions who are willing to tackle these systemic issues. And especially those, in my experience, those who are in the system, especially in the state institutions, if we find a person, that person can make a huge change maker. And it all depends on whether we look for that person instead of agonizing the state institutions. Instead, let's look into the amongst state institutions, or even within the state institutions, the champions who are also working for the betterment of their own country. The second point is about the conversation completely changes if you start talking about as an ally with the government institutions who are usually we blame as the institutions who put in restrictions, but talk about from the same language, let's say the SDG, and across the globe, all the governments are also striving to make difference within the umbrella of the SDG. And there are government adopted, nationally adopted policies and national programs, and how we can find specific points that, you know, connects us, and we find a common ground there, and then push the change within the society, right? And the third one, I think, perhaps, you know, I will go back to the partnership with this particular state institutions who are whose mission can make really a difference in the people's lives. For example, in Uzbekistan, we are partnering with the state agency on anti-corruption, and we are looking at 3 different angles that impact the young people. These are the employment, education, and healthcare. And we're looking to, together with the state agency on anti-corruption, some of the systemic loopholes, and that is also creating a challenge for them as a particular, you know, dedicated government institution, and to link them up with the youth champions or the youth activists on the ground, and finding that the balance and refining the agenda. And that is a lot more powerful in my experience, instead of, you know, playing the blame game, right? So I will stop there, and over to you, perhaps, Zura.
Yes, Zura, please share your learning and reflections and recommendations for how we can all do this better going forward.
Yes, I think for peace building, we need to avoid concentrating on I'll rephrase. I think we need to find the most resilient in societies, and then see how they are doing what they're doing, how they're bringing people together, how they're keeping doors open, how they are maintaining a positive mindset in a space which is restrictive, and it is becoming more restrictive. And there's a lot we could learn from that. And on a day-to-day basis, I see that in my surroundings. And as a sector, we could learn quite a lot from them. Just today, I was speaking with a woman who was talking to me about how she deals with children and enabling them to, still girl children, enabling them to have a similar experience to their male friends, and then this is in case of sort of 8-10-year-olds. So when you see that there's a person who should be completely hopeless and immobile under the restrictions that she's living in, but she is doing something to change the experiences of children, then you get something, you not only get inspiration and some sense of hope, but you also see how people are using their resilience, their patience, to find the right ways for doing things in places like Afghanistan. And those are the people, those are the allies we need to work with. And the other thing I've learned is that in my country, whenever we've treated the civil society as a means to reach the end goal in short term, we have failed. We need to see how can we build the civil society, or we facilitate the building up of civil society, even if it collapses and rebuilds itself many times. But we need to create a civil society that's going to be there for the long run, that could be there, that could have the patience of working towards something that is going to be sustainable and slow to achieve. In Afghanistan, if you just pick 100 or so years, governments have collapsed on the issue of girls' education, and civil society has lost its best minds many times, sometimes to airlifts to the US, but then other times to to mass murders and assassinations back in the late 80s, early 90s. So in all of that, what was the commonality between all of those attempts to bring social change through political means and swift changes through civil society was this desire to bring quick change. We can't do that. We need to make sure that this happens quite slowly. It needs to happen organically, and we can only do that by placing men and women, vulnerable people, youth, ethnic, religious minorities at a position where they're economically empowered, where they're providing services, where they naturally are building their constituencies. They are also gaining the right skills to sit down and talk to each other. And one of the things we've done at SURJ in Afghanistan in the last 3 years is to enable people to sit with the people that they have been made to believe is their enemy for the last many, many decades. So we have enabled the Taliban to sit with the civil society, and for the civil society as well to sit with the Taliban, because the mistrust is on both sides. And as we give them, and our place is to give them these skills, our place is to give them the resources, our place is to support them as they build their resilience.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have a couple questions already in the chat, but others feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you have the hand raise option, you can feel free to do that. But maybe to start, so one person's wondering about how the digital authoritarianism is impacting peace building in the various countries where you all are working, and then more specific examples about how we identify appropriate peace building values as opposed to humanitarian, and how to build potential pathways to work with or around government or civil society actors that are obstructing or inhibiting peace building efforts. I will let Rebecca, Zura, and Kanesh, if any of you want to answer one or all of those questions, feel free to just jump right in or let me know. Okay, Zura.
Yeah. I want to talk about the issue of building potential pathways to work with or around government or civil society actors. Now, there is, if you look at the example of places like Iran, one way their civil society outside the country was developed was the extraction of their divergent views, political views, civil society actors, artists, and so on. And they were taken out of the country. And of course, at the individual level, I mean, and it has happened to Afghanistan as well. At an individual level, of course, I believe that all of us should get to live where we want to live. We should have access to freedoms, and we should do things that helps us to reach our potential. However, as a field, if we invest in extracting the divergent views, we're not going to change a society. And one thing that we have lost in our lifetime in Afghanistan, and my lifetime in Afghanistan, is the religious diversity. Our small non-Muslim population were extracted from Afghanistan. They were encouraged to leave Afghanistan. And now we have left with a huge gap. So taking people out of the context, placing them in a completely different context, and creating this industry of outrage and advocacy at an international level, where a lot of it could be completely ignored by the authorities by just a click of a switch or censorship of certain media, is not beneficial. And it disconnects, it creates divides. And we need to really think about that. We need to see how can we support people on the ground? How can we connect people so that they can work together? And this becomes really dangerous when the narratives around these divisions, so those that stayed behind and those that left. And in Iran has faced this for far longer than Afghanistan has. So right now, you automatically divide the Iranian civil society into those that stayed and supported the government, regardless of what they're experiencing and what kind of acts of resilience they're performing every day, and those that supported human rights and democracy and diversity who have left. Now, these narratives are emerging about Afghanistan as well, and we need to be really careful around that. And we need to start as a sector, when we talk about dialogue, when we talk about peace building, being very vocal about the fact that those that take part in demonstrations, those that take part in international advocacy to try and bring about change, those that sit around the negotiating table, those that knock at the doors of policymakers inside the countries like Afghanistan. We are part of the same continuum of peace building, and we need to be connected. And we need to work with this understanding and strengthen each other's work rather than create an opposition within the civil society. So I think we need to think about that. And within this space, of course, both Rebecca and Kinesh talked about something that really attracts about the way search things is positive deviance, people who deviate from the party line within these restrictive environments. So within this continuum, we need to have a space for those people as well, because those are very critical and key people. But one thing we need to make sure as peace builders, we're very careful about is that we don't fuel this idea that civil society is in violent opposition to these authorities. I feel really sad when I see that in a lot of the conferences on Afghanistan, people in the name of peace building are actually calling for another armed insurgency in Afghanistan, or they're calling for harsher sanctions in Afghanistan, or they're calling for aid to be reduced in Afghanistan. You know, these acts of violence is not really going to help anyone.
Is there Rebecca or Kinesh, do you want to respond to these questions?
Rebecca, after you.
Okay, I'll talk briefly on the digital authoritarianism one. And I mean, this is not necessarily that it, anyway, you know, disclaimers and all of that. But I think what we've seen is that people are getting smarter about government control over information. So VPNs are much more common. People know how to navigate the system much more savvily now than they did a year or 2 or 3 ago. And I think people are learning from each other and seeing what is happening in other countries and preparing a little bit more accordingly, although of course not everyone, and it depends a bit on your access and things like that. But I think we are getting more savvy than we were. I think the flip side of it is so much information is on your phone and on your computer and that kind of thing. And just, you know, again, looking at the Venezuelan election context and police going door to door to see what photos you have, what messages you've exchanged, those kinds of things, and people needing to be really conscientious about wiping their phones because you never know when you might get checked or you might get stopped, but also how something might get interpreted. So, and just how much more photos of different people are available and things like that. And maybe it wasn't you posting your photo, but you're in somebody else's photo that appeared on their social media and people are tracking it down. And so I do think the digital space is, you know, it has a lot of opportunities and it allows a lot of gatherings to move to different places that, you know, in person perhaps wasn't possible. But I do think it's also taking on new dynamics in terms of how people are being persecuted or things as well. And I think, you know, it will continue, obviously it'll continue to evolve.
Kinesh, did you want to come in on this? Oh, did you lose him? I'd have dropped. Okay, oh, things happening. We probably have time for one or two more questions, or if anyone
Hello?
wants to share. Oh, I'm hearing something now. If anyone wants to share their own experience about how you've dealt with these challenges in any of these contexts or in any other contexts. James, please go ahead. Oh, we're unable to hear you, right? Is that just me? No.
We
Sorry.
can't hear you, James.
Sorry about that. Maybe if you want to put it in the chat. Frederick, did you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Yeah, I thank you for this meeting. And it was very critical to, this is Frederick from Uganda, East Africa. Can you hear me? Yeah, the challenges of civil society, particularly the theme on the attack on the civil society in the era of how can we build peace when we are under heavy attack? I just wanted to inquire from the presenters, because this is seems to be all over the globe, and it's very, very rampant in Africa, and particularly in my country, because even right now, Facebook is completely banned from Uganda. We are not allowed to have Facebook. Of course, there are other human rights, there are other issues that peace builders are facing. Convening is becoming literally difficult. There's a lot of targeting and things like that. I just wanted to inquire, how can we be helped? Because you find that peace builders are under a lot of persecution, and there is no help completely. There is no, you find they are starved, the people are, identified, things like that. And we don't have help. How can we be helped by the different actors, the international community, the Alliance of Peace Building, are engaged, but also to constructively continue to popularize these messages of peace in a context of turbulence? How can we be supported? Because we are operating under turbulent context. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. Maybe let's take from Andrew, and then we'll give our panelists a chance to respond, and that will probably be the end of our time. But go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for letting me ask a question too. I would like to know how you deal, with the allocation of efforts in terms of constructing civil society, augmenting resilience, protecting children mainly from trauma, and building new generations of people who are stronger, more resilient, and able to deal with challenges coming in. I mean, I'm living in Germany, which is a privileged nation, and I've worked a lot with children. We have, a majority of children that come from countries where they have been traumatized through war, through acts of war. And I will not talk about the causes of these wars, but the point is that we face the situation here, and the way we then deal with these children is to allow them to create a new identity for themselves. And for example, in schools, we make projects with them. And tomorrow I will present one of these projects where it was 99 children, which came from 90 different nations. And they all had bad experiences in the past. And so I did a project with them for 2 years in which we constructed a new identity working with tales, with fables. Yeah. So each child took into the class, for example, a fable of his own country. We collected them all, and then we created a new common fable from all the 90 fables we had. So this kind of project, is what we have the luxury to do here in Germany. But the children are the same, whether they are in Uzbekistan, in Iran, in Afghanistan, or in Iraq. It doesn't matter, because when they come here, they have the same background. And I see that what we do here could maybe be done elsewhere. Question is, what are the opportunities? Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to turn.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry, I need to turn to the panelists and give them a chance to respond, and then offer any final points as we close. I know we have the closing plenary soon, so maybe Rebecca and then Zora and then Kanesh, if you've been able to join again, if you want to pick up on any of these questions and then offer us any concluding points that you want to leave everyone with today.
Sure, I'll maybe just answer quickly on the two questions. One for the situation in Uganda. Just, I know it's really hard and sometimes it can feel like a lot of pressure. I think the biggest things I would encourage is, there are a number of peace-building organizations in Uganda because of the history and the region and all of that. I would look for allies, and also making sure that the allies don't just represent the same perspectives, but how do you try to build a diverse coalition of peace-building allies in the country, and start with some of the soft questions first. What are some of the non-threatening questions, et cetera? And I think that would be my pivot and brief answer on the question of children, because I think that could be an entire panel in itself. But I would say, I guess, number one, that in difficult regimes and difficult environments, shared interest in children can be one of the best entry points, because there's solidarity in being parents, there's solidarity in caring about future of children. We've often found that's been a place of engagement. And then I think how children can represent their experiences in war, in conflict, in various challenging situations in their own voices can both change people's perceptions of the situation itself, as well as their perception of children and the value that children offer, and the real intelligence and integrity that children also bring into the space that should be valued and encouraged. And thank you everybody for the panel today. It's been a really interesting chance to talk.
Zora, in 30 seconds or so, any answers and concluding points?
Yes, on the issue of children, I just want to make one point, that although you live in Germany and it's very different context, but we're so interconnected. And the debate around peace building in Afghanistan, or sanctions in Iran, or what is going on in the rest of the world, in Venezuela, Central Asia, Middle East, everywhere else in the world, it's all very interlinked and interconnected. And how we deal with integration in European context, how we deal with identity in European context, in more peaceful places, also determines what happens in these other countries later on. So we have to, whatever interventions we design, we need to keep that in mind. It was a pleasure to talk to all of you. I hope we can continue the conversations.
Thanks, and I think we lost Kanesh on the Uzbekistan internet. But yes, thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for your excellent questions and comments, and hope that you have a great remainder of your PeaceCon week. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.